Carlton Bright's shoulders sagged as he pulled into the driveway of his modest suburban home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of corruption he battled all day. At 38, the environmental engineer felt decades older, worn down by the constant fight against global tech's attempts to bypass regulations for their dam project. He stepped inside, greeted by silence. Victoria's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of his wife. The house was a mess, as usual. Dishes piled in the sink, toys scattered across the living room floor. Carlton sighed, resigned to another evening of cleaning up after his family. He started in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary as he replayed the day's arguments in his mind. By the time he reached the upstairs bathroom, his frustration had simmered down to a dull ache. He emptied the small trash can mechanically, barely registering the contents until a flash of white plastic caught his eye. Carlton froze, the half-filled garbage bag slipping from his fingers. Nestled among crumpled tissues and empty toothpaste tubes lay a pregnancy test. Positive. His mind raced, thoughts crashing into each other like waves in a storm. It had been 5 years since his vasectomy, a decision he and Victoria had made together after the twins were born. They'd agreed their family was complete with Emma and Olivia, now 7 years old. Carlton's hands shook as he picked up the test, studying it as if it might suddenly change its result. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. There had to be a logical explanation. He found Victoria in the living room, sprawled on the couch, her attention fixed on her phone. She didn't even look up as he entered. "Vic," Carlton said, his voice strained. "I found something in the bathroom trash." Victoria's eyes flicked up briefly, then returned to her screen. "Amen." Carlton held out the pregnancy test. "Care to explain this?" For a split second, something like alarm flashed across Victoria's face, but it vanished so quickly, Carlton wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. She shrugged, her tone dismissive. "Oh, that must be a false positive. Or maybe one of my friends used our bathroom." "Don't be so paranoid, Carlton." She went back to scrolling on her phone, effectively ending the conversation. Carlton stood there, the test still in his hand, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Victoria's casual tone, her lack of surprise or concern, it all felt wrong. He opened his mouth to press further, but the words died on his lips. What if he was overreacting? Maybe it was a friend's test, or a false positive, like she said. Starting an argument now would only make him look foolish and paranoid. Carlton retreated to the kitchen, tossing the test in the trash. As he prepared dinner for the family, his mind churned with unanswered questions. He resolved to keep his suspicions to himself for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Over the next few weeks, Carlton found himself hyper-aware of Victoria's every move. It was as if the pregnancy test had lifted a veil, revealing a host of behaviors he'd previously overlooked or dismissed. Victoria was constantly on her phone, fingers flying over the screen as she typed out messages. Whenever Carlton entered the room, she'd quickly lock the screen or flip it face down. Her hushed phone calls became more frequent, always taken in another room or outside on the patio. "Just work stuff," she'd say with a breezy smile when he asked. But Carlton knew her boutique clothing store didn't require that level of constant communication. The girls' nights out increased in frequency as well. Victoria would breeze out the door in her most flattering outfits, leaving Carlton to handle dinner and bedtime for the twins. She'd return late, smelling of wine and wearing a secretive smile. Carlton's suspicions knotted him, but he held his tongue. He needed more information before confronting Victoria. The opportunity presented itself at the annual neighborhood barbecue, hosted by the Johnsons next door. Carlton was manning the grill, flipping burgers, and trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. Victoria flitted from group to group, champagne flute in hand, laughing a little too loudly at every joke. As he added another round of hot dogs to the grill, Carlton overheard a conversation from the nearby patio table. Victoria's friend Marla was speaking in a stage whisper. clearly tipsy and oblivious to Carlton's presence. "So, Dish," Marla giggled, leaning in close to another woman. "How's Vicky's secret relationship?" Carlton's hand tightened on the spatula, his knuckles turning white. "The other woman?" he asked quietly. "Susan from 3 houses down," the woman replied, glancing around furtively. "Jerome. God, I don't know how she landed him. That man is so charming." Marla snorted into her drink. "Right? I mean, Carlton's nice and all, but Jerome Bailey, he's in another league entirely." The name hit Carlton like a physical blow. Jerome Bailey, the flashy real estate developer known for his shady dealings and womanizing ways. Carlton had crossed paths with him at city council meetings, always leaving with a bad taste in his mouth. He stood there, frozen, as the women continued to gossip. They painted a vivid picture of Victoria's affair, encounters at high-end hotels, lavish gifts, promises of a life filled with luxury and excitement. Carlton mechanically flipped burgers, his mind reeling. How long had this been going on? Was the pregnancy test Victoria's after all? Could she really be carrying Jerome Bailey's child? He made it through the rest of the barbecue on autopilot, plastering on a smile and making small talk. Victoria didn't seem to notice anything amiss, too caught up in her own little world. That night, after Victoria had gone to bed, Carlton called the one person he thought he could trust. Stephen Ho, his best friend since college. Stephen, a financial advisor, had always been there for Carlton through thick and thin. "Carlton," Stephen answered groggily. "It's late, man. Everything okay?" Carlton paced the kitchen, keeping his voice low. "I need to talk. Steve, it's about Victoria. I think she's being unfaithful." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Stephen spoke again, his tone was carefully neutral. "That's a big accusation, Carl. What makes you think that?" Carlton poured out everything. The pregnancy test, Victoria's secretive behavior, and what he'd overheard at the barbecue. Stephen listened quietly, only speaking to ask for clarification on certain points. "Jesus, Carl. I don't know what to say," Stephen finally responded. "It seems so unlike Victoria." "I know what I heard, Steve," Carlton insisted. I don't know what to do now." Stephen sighed heavily. "Look, don't do anything rash. Get some sleep. Try to clear your head. We'll meet for lunch tomorrow and figure out a game plan." "Okay," Carlton agreed, feeling a small measure of relief. At least he wasn't alone in this anymore. He thanked Stephen and hung up, unaware that his supposed best friend was already dialing Victoria's number. In a tastefully decorated high-rise apartment across town, Victoria's phone buzzed. She extracted herself from Jerome's embrace, frowning at the caller ID. "Stephen, what's going on?" Jerome propped himself up on one elbow, his chiseled features creased with annoyance. "Who's calling at this hour?" Victoria held up a hand to silence him as she listened to Stephen's urgent whispers. Her face paled. "He knows," she hissed. "How much?" Jerome sat up fully now, his dark eyes narrowing. Victoria listened for another moment before ending the call. "We have a problem," she said, turning to face her lover. "Carlton's getting suspicious. We need to be more careful." Jerome's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Please, your husband wouldn't know what to do with this information if we handed it to him on a silver platter. He's too trusting." Victoria's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're right, of course. Still, we should take precautions. I'm not ready to give up this comfortable life just yet." As they fell back into bed, plotting and scheming, Carlton tossed and turned in his empty bed across town. Blissfully unaware that his closest friend had just betrayed him, he clung to the small comfort that he at least had Stephen in his corner. The following week found Carlton buried in work, desperately trying to gather evidence against Global Tech's illegal activities. The corrupt corporation was pushing hard to bypass environmental regulations for a massive new development, one that would devastate the local ecosystem. Carlton sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of reports and environmental impact studies. His eyes burned from staring at his computer screen, combing through data for any inconsistencies or red flags. He barely registered the knock on his office door, burning the midnight oil again. Bright. Carlton looked up to see his colleague, Diane, leaning against the doorframe. Her expression was a mix of concern and admiration. "Someone has to," Carlton replied, rubbing his eyes. "Global tech isn't going to expose itself." Diane stepped into the office, lowering her voice. "Be careful, Carlton. I've heard rumors that they're not above playing dirty to get what they want." Carlton's jaw tightened. "I'm counting on it. The dirtier they play, the more evidence we'll have to bring them down." As Diane left, Carlton's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Working late again. Don't wait up." He stared at the message, a familiar mixture of anger and hurt churning in his gut. Part of him wanted to confront her to demand the truth, but the rational part of his brain knew he needed more proof before making any accusations. Carlton threw himself back into his work with renewed vigor. If he was fighting battles on all fronts, so be it. He'd win them all or go down swinging. Hours later, Carlton finally called it a night. He drove home in a daze, his mind still buzzing with environmental data and half-formed strategies against global tech. The house was quiet when he arrived. Victoria's car was noticeably absent from the driveway. Carlton found Mrs. Delgado, their elderly neighbor, dozing on the couch. She often watched the twins when both Carlton and Victoria worked late. "Mr. Bright," she said, startling awake. "I'm sorry, I must have dozed off." Carlton forced a smile. "No worries, Mrs. D. I appreciate you staying so late. How were the girls?" "Oh, they were angels as always," Mrs. Delgado replied, gathering her things. "They were so excited to tell me about their day, especially about the nice man who sometimes picks them up from school when their mommy is busy." Carlton froze his hand halfway to his wallet to pay Mrs. Delgado. "I'm sorry, what man?" Mrs. Delgado looked confused. "The one they call their fun uncle. Tall fellow, very handsome, drives a fancy red sports car." The description matched Jerome Bailey perfectly. Carlton felt a surge of rage, so powerful it made his vision blur for a moment. He took a deep breath, not wanting to alarm Mrs. Delgado or, worse, have her mention his reaction to Victoria. "Ah, yes," Carlton managed, his voice strained. "Their mother's friend. Thank you for reminding me." After Mrs. Delgado left, Carlton went to check on the twins. Emma and Olivia were sound asleep, their matching blonde curls spread across their pillows. Looking at their innocent faces, Carlton felt a fresh wave of anger at Victoria's betrayal. It wasn't just him she was hurting. It was their entire family. He sat on the edge of Emma's bed, gently stroking her hair. "Daddy's going to fix this," he whispered. "I promise." Returning to the living room, Carlton poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sank onto the couch. He pulled out his phone, staring at Victoria's last text message. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before he tossed the phone aside and sighed. No, he wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Victoria and Jerome thought they were so clever, so above it all. They had no idea what was coming. Carlton downed his whiskey in one burning gulp. He'd play the oblivious, trusting husband for now. Let them think they were getting away with it. But behind the scenes, he'd be planning, gathering evidence, preparing for the day when he'd bring their whole world crashing down around them. As he poured another drink, Carlton allowed himself a small smile. They thought him weak, too trusting. By the time he was done, they'd realized just how wrong they were. The dining room was awash in soft candlelight, creating an illusion of warmth that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Carlton sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of neutrality as he watched Victoria fuss over the place settings. "I wanted tonight to be special," Victoria chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. "We so rarely have time for a proper family dinner these days." Carlton nodded, saying nothing. He sensed something was coming from the moment Victoria had insisted on this elaborate meal. His suspicions were confirmed when she clinked her glass, calling for attention. "I have wonderful news," Victoria announced, her eyes shining with what Carlton now recognized as carefully rehearsed emotion. "We're going to have another baby." The twins, Emma and Olivia, squealed with delight. Carlton's parents, visiting for the weekend, offered enthusiastic congratulations. Through it all, Carlton maintained his composure, playing the part of the surprised and elated husband to perfection. "That's fantastic news, darling," he said, raising his glass in a toast. If anyone noticed the lack of warmth in his eyes, they didn't mention it. As the meal progressed, Carlton observed Victoria with a detached fascination. She was putting on quite a show, gushing about baby names and nursery colors. He almost admired her acting skills, if not for the rage simmering just beneath his calm exterior. Later that night, after the girls were in bed and his parents had retired to the guest room, Carlton retreated to his office. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook from a hidden compartment in his desk drawer. Inside were meticulous notes detailing Victoria's comings and goings, snippets of overheard phone conversations, and other suspicious behavior. Carlton added today's date and a brief entry about the pregnancy announcement. He'd been documenting everything for weeks now, building a case that would leave no room for doubt, but he needed more irrefutable proof that would stand up in court and in the court of public opinion. With a smile, Carlton picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd researched extensively. "Zachary Stark Investigations," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Stark, I'd like to arrange a meeting. I have a delicate situation that requires your expertise." 2 days later, Carlton sat across from Zachary Stark in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of town. Stark was a burly man with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He listened intently as Carlton laid out the situation, nodding occasionally and taking notes. "I need ironclad evidence," Carlton finished. "Photos, videos, financial records, anything that proves the affair and any potential conspiracy against me." Stark leaned back, sizing Carlton up. "This won't be cheap, Mr. Bright. And it won't be pretty." Carlton met the investigator's gaze without flinching. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I want them exposed." As Carlton left the diner, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He froze, staring at the headline. "Respected pediatrician Samantha Bailey honored for Children's Health Initiative." The accompanying photo showed an elegant woman with kind eyes accepting an award. Carlton's mind raced. Samantha Bailey, Jerome's wife. Another innocent caught in the crossfire of Victoria and Jerome's selfish actions. For a moment, Carlton hesitated. Was he going too far? But then he remembered the look on Victoria's face as she announced her pregnancy, the casual way she'd involved their children in her deception. That evening, using a public computer at the library and a disposable email address, Carlton composed a message to Samantha Bailey. It was brief, providing just enough information to raise suspicions without revealing his identity. He attached a photo Stark had already provided: Jerome and Victoria entering a high-end hotel together. As he hit send, Carlton felt a satisfaction. Let them all face the consequences of their actions. He was done being the oblivious, trusting husband. It was time for the architect of vengeance to begin his work. Weeks passed, and Carlton's web of intelligence grew ever wider. Zachary Stark proved to be worth every penny, providing a steady stream of damning evidence against Victoria and Jerome. But it was Carlton's own investigation that uncovered the most shocking betrayal of all. As Victoria's baby shower approached, planned with nauseating enthusiasm by her sycophantic friend Kimberly, Carlton found himself reviewing some troubling discrepancies in his financial records. Something wasn't adding up, and the trail led straight to his supposed best friend, Stephen Ho. Carlton sat in his car outside Stephen's office building, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. He trusted Stephen with everything: his suspicions about Victoria, his fears for his marriage, even the management of a significant portion of his investments. Now, staring at the bank statements spread across the passenger seat, Carlton felt a cold fury building inside him. Not only had Stephen been helping Victoria hide her affair for months, but he'd also been misappropriating funds from Carlton's accounts. The money trail led to a new property development, spearheaded by none other than Jerome Bailey. Carlton's first instinct was to storm into Stephen's office and confront him. But as he reached for the door handle, he paused. No, that wasn't the smart play. Stephen, Victoria, Jerome, they'd all thought they were so clever, so untouchable. Let them keep thinking that right up until the moment Carlton pulled the rug out from under them. With a calm he didn't entirely feel, Carlton started the car and drove to his bank. He spent the next few hours moving his remaining assets to secure accounts, leaving just enough in the compromised ones to avoid raising suspicion. As he worked, his mind raced with plans within plans, mapping out his path to revenge. That evening, Carlton met Stephen for their regular beer and pool night at O'Malley's pub. He laughed at Stephen's jokes, commiserated about work stress, and pretended not to notice the slight tremor in Stephen's hand when Victoria's name came up in conversation. "You know, Steve," Carlton said as they were leaving, clapping his friend on the shoulder, "I don't know what I'd do without you. You've been a rock through all this craziness with Victoria." Stephen's smile was strained, guilt flashing in his eyes for just a moment. "That's what friends are for, right? You can always count on me." "I know," Carlton replied, his own smile never reaching his eyes. "Believe me, I know." As Stephen's car disappeared around the corner, Carlton's genial expression hardened into one of determination. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been saving for just the right moment. "Sherry Woodward's office," a crisp voice answered. "Ms. Woodward, this is Carlton Bright. I find myself in need of a very discreet and very determined attorney. I was told you're the best." Back at work, Carlton threw himself into his case against Global Tech with renewed vigor. The corporation's attempts to bypass environmental regulations for their new development had grown increasingly brazen, and Carlton was determined to bring them down. Late one night, as Carlton pored over environmental impact reports and zoning laws, a hesitant knock sounded at his office door. He looked up to see Buddy Blackwell, a young environmental journalist he crossed paths with at city council meetings. "Mr. Bright, I hope I'm not interrupting," Buddy said, fidgeting with his press badge. "I've been following your work against Global Tech, and well, I think I might have some information that could help." Carlton leaned back in his chair, studying the nervous journalist. "Come in, Mr. Blackwell. Close the door behind you. I think we have a lot to discuss." For the next few hours, Carlton and Buddy pored over documents, connecting dots, and building a case that would expose Global Tech's illegal activities. As the first rays of dawn crept through the office blinds, Carlton felt a spark of hope. "Here, at least, is one battle I could win cleanly." "This is excellent, Mr. Bright," Buddy said. "With your insider knowledge and my sources, we could really expose Global Tech for what they are." Carlton nodded, a smile playing at his lips. "That's the plan, Mr. Blackwell. Let's take them down." As Buddy gathered his notes to leave, Carlton felt a twinge of something like regret. Here was someone driven by a genuine desire for justice, untainted by the betrayal and deceit that had come to define Carlton's personal life. For a moment, he envied the young journalist's straightforward mission. But as Carlton turned back to his desk, his eyes fell on a framed photo of Emma and Olivia. He was fighting for them now, on all fronts. There would be time for regrets later, if he allowed himself to have any at all. As Victoria's pregnancy progressed, she and Jerome grew increasingly bold in their affair. They were often seen together at upscale restaurants and exclusive events, barely bothering to hide their relationship. Victoria's excuses to Carlton grew flimsier by the day, but he played the role of the oblivious husband to perfection. What Victoria and Jerome didn't know was that every public appearance, every careless display of affection, was meticulously documented by Zachary Stark and his team. Carlton received regular updates, each more damning than the last. He stored it all away, building an arsenal for the day of reckoning. One unseasonably warm afternoon, Carlton found himself at a charity golf tournament, reluctantly partnered with Jerome Bailey. As they walked between holes, Jerome's arrogance was on full display. "You know, Carlton," Jerome said, his tone condescending, "I've always admired how understanding you are. Not many men would be so accepting of their wife's friendship with another man." Carlton gripped his golf club tighter, forcing a neutral expression. "Victoria and I have always believed in trust and independence in our marriage." Jerome chuckled, clapping Carlton on the back. Of course. It's just that some men might get the wrong idea, seeing their wife spending so much time with a successful, handsome businessman. But not you, eh? You're made of sterner stuff." It took every ounce of Carlton's self-control not to swing the golf club at Jerome's smug face. Instead, he smiled blandly and said, "I suppose I am." Later that week, Carlton overheard Victoria on the phone with Stephen, their voices drifting through the partially open study door. "Everything's on track," Victoria was saying, her tone hushed but excited. "Once the baby's born, we'll file for divorce. With what you've done to his accounts, Carlton won't know what hit him. He'll be broke, and Jerome and I will be free to start our new life." Carlton's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to remain still, listening. Stephen's reply was hesitant. "I don't know, Vicky. This is getting out of hand. Carlton trusts me. Maybe we should." "Don't you dare back out now," Victoria hissed. "You're in this as deep as we are. Or do you want Carlton to find out how you've been managing his investments?" There was a long pause before Stephen sighed. "No, you're right. I'm in. Just be careful, okay?" As Victoria ended the call, Carlton silently retreated to his home office. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sherry Woodward's number. "Ms. Woodward, it's time to move forward with those legal maneuvers we discussed, and I need to make some changes to my will and financial arrangements. How soon can we meet?" Over the next few weeks, guided by Sherry's razor-sharp legal mind, Carlton put into motion a complex series of moves designed to protect his assets and lay the groundwork for his eventual divorce. Accounts were shifted, trusts were established for the twins, and ironclad prenuptial agreements were unearthed and reinforced. All the while, Victoria, Jerome, and Stephen continued their plotting, blissfully unaware that Carlton was always 2 steps ahead. But it wasn't just his finances that Carlton was working to protect. As he delved deeper into Victoria's deception, he uncovered a painful truth that cemented his resolve to destroy her carefully crafted image. It started with small things, the twins mentioning that Mommy was always too busy to help with homework, or that she'd forgotten to pick them up from soccer practice again. Carlton began paying closer attention, and what he saw filled him with a cold fury. Victoria's neglect of Emma and Olivia had become systematic. She prioritized her affair and her social life over their well-being, manipulating the girls emotionally to keep them quiet about her absences and mistakes. One evening, Carlton found Emma crying in her room. When he asked what was wrong, her answer broke his heart. "Mommy said if I told you she forgot my recital, you'd get mad and leave us." Emma sobbed. "I don't want you to leave, Daddy." Carlton gathered his daughter in his arms, smoothing her hair as she cried. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I promise." As he comforted Emma, Carlton's mind was racing. He'd known Victoria was selfish, but this level of emotional manipulation of their children was unforgivable. That night, after the girls were asleep, Carlton added a new section to his evidence file. This wasn't just about exposing an affair anymore. It was about protecting Emma and Olivia from a mother who saw them as little more than props in her perfect life narrative. As he worked late into the night, cataloging instances of Victoria's neglect and manipulation, Carlton felt the last shreds of doubt or hesitation fall away. Victoria had made her choice, prioritizing her affair over their family. Now it was time for Carlton to make his. The architect of vengeance looked out the window at the quiet suburban street, a smile playing on his lips. The wet was tightening and soon, very soon, it would be time to spring the trap. The Oakmont Country Club buzzed with excitement as guests arrived for Victoria Bright's baby shower. Women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits mingled on the manicured lawn, sipping champagne and exchanging gossip. Victoria held court near the gift table, her pregnancy glow enhanced by expertly applied makeup and a flowing maternity gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jerome Bailey stood nearby, playing the role of the supportive family friend to perfection. His hand occasionally brushed Victoria's lower back, a gesture just intimate enough to raise eyebrows, but not quite scandalous enough to cause outright shock. "Vicky, darling, you're absolutely glowing," gushed Kimberly, Victoria's self-appointed best friend and shower organizer. "This is going to be the event of the season." Victoria preened under the attention, her smile smug. "Well, I do have a lot to celebrate. A new baby, a loving husband, wonderful friends. Life couldn't be more perfect." As if on cue, a ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Carlton Bright had arrived, looking impeccable in a tailored suit. He carried a stack of elegant envelopes, a slight smile playing on his lips. Victoria's eyes widened in alarm. This wasn't part of the plan. Carlton was supposed to be at a work conference, conveniently unable to attend the shower. She quickly composed herself, plastering on a bright smile. "Carlton, darling, what a wonderful surprise." She air-kissed his cheek, whispering harshly, "What are you doing here?" Carlton's smile never wavered. "I couldn't miss my wife's big day, could I? In fact, I brought a little something to share with all our guests." Before Victoria could react, Carlton began moving through the crowd, handing out the envelopes with a genial smile. "A little party favor," he explained to the curious onlookers. "Best opened all together, I think." Victoria felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She caught Jerome's eye across the room, seeing her own panic reflected there. What was Carlton up to? As the last envelope was distributed, Carlton took center stage, tapping a spoon against his champagne flute for attention. "Friends, family, esteemed guests," he began, his voice carrying across the now silent lawn. "We're here to celebrate new life, new beginnings, but before we do, I think it's time for some truths to come to light. Why don't we all open our envelopes together?" The sound of tearing paper filled the air, followed by gasps of shock and murmurs of disbelief. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as she saw what Carlton had distributed. Photos of her and Jerome in compromising positions, printouts of incriminating text messages, financial records showing Stephen's misappropriation and her own complicity. But the final blow came in the form of two official-looking documents. DNA test results proving Carlton wasn't the father of Victoria's unborn child, and a paternity test identifying Jerome as the real father. The crowd erupted into chaos. Victoria stumbled back, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Jerome pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of fury. "You scoundrel!" he snarled at Carlton. Carlton's laugh cut him off. "No right. To expose your affair with my wife. To reveal how you plan to trick me into raising your child. Oh, I think I had every right, Jerome." He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. Suddenly, Victoria and Jerome's voices filled the air, discussing their plans in explicit detail. Victoria felt a wave rise in her throat as she heard herself laugh about how easy it would be to fool Carlton. A commotion near the back of the crowd drew everyone's attention. Samantha Bailey, Jerome's wife, had arrived just in time to hear the damning recording. Her face was a study in shock and fury as she stormed towards her husband. "You traitor," she hissed, the crack of her palm against Jerome's cheek echoing across the suddenly silent gathering. Without another word, Samantha spun on her heel and strode away, leaving a stunned Jerome in her wake. Victoria, her face ashen, tried one last desperate gambit. "Carlton, please," she pleaded, reaching for him. "We can talk about this. There's an explanation." Carlton stepped back, his eyes cold. "Save it, Victoria. The time for talking is long past. I hope you and Jerome will be very happy together. You deserve each other." As Carlton walked away, head held high, Victoria collapsed into a nearby chair. She looked around at the faces of her friends and family, seeing only shock, disapproval, and in some cases, vindictive glee at her downfall. In that moment, Victoria Bright realized that her carefully crafted life of luxury and deception had just gone up in flames. The weeks following the baby shower debacle were a whirlwind of damage control for Victoria and Jerome. They huddled with high-priced lawyers and crisis management teams, desperately trying to salvage what remained of their reputations. "We need to get ahead of this," Jerome insisted, pacing Victoria's living room. "Paint Carlton as the villain. Say he was unfaithful. Make people sympathize with us." Victoria nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but calculating. "I can play the victim. Say I was afraid to leave him, that you were my savior." But Carlton was always one step ahead. As Victoria and Jerome's accusations hit the media, Carlton calmly released a series of videos. They showed Victoria's repeated neglect of Emma and Olivia, canceling plans with the girls to meet Jerome, forgetting school events, and manipulating the twins to keep quiet about her absences and mistakes. Even more damning were the clips of Jerome, clearly intoxicated, boasting about how easy it was to manipulate Carlton. "The guys at Chump," Jerome slurred in one video, filmed covertly at a bar, "think he's so smart with his environmental crusades. Meanwhile, I'm involved with his wife and spending his money. It's almost too easy." Public opinion, initially divided, swung decisively in Carlton's favor. Victoria and Jerome found themselves shunned by former friends and business associates, their phones suddenly going unanswered. Meanwhile, Carlton was making waves in his professional life. The evidence he and Buddy Blackwell had gathered against Global Tech was ironclad. Carlton's testimony before a grand jury was powerful and convincing, laying bare the corporation's illegal activities and disregard for environmental regulations. As Carlton left the courthouse after his final day of testimony, he was mobbed by reporters. "Mr. Bright, how does it feel to bring down one of the biggest corporate polluters in the state?" Carlton's response was measured but forceful. "This isn't about personal satisfaction. It's about protecting our environment and holding corporations accountable. Global Tech thought they were above the law. Today, we proved them wrong." The headlines the next day were glowing. "Environmental hero brings down corporate giant." Carlton's whistleblowing had earned him national recognition, with environmental groups hailing him as a champion of corporate accountability. This positive press, combined with the evidence of Victoria's infidelity and Jerome's boasts, turned public opinion firmly in Carlton's favor. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Carlton and condemnation for Victoria and Jerome. But Carlton wasn't done yet. While the public drama played out, he had been quietly working with authorities, providing evidence of Stephen's misappropriation. The betrayal of his oldest friends still stung, but Carlton's desire for justice outweighed any lingering sentiment. It all came to a head on a rainy Tuesday morning. Stephen Ho, looking haggard and terrified, was led out of his home in handcuffs. He had been caught trying to board a flight to a non-extradition country with a suitcase full of cash and a fake passport. As Stephen was shoved into the back of a police car, his eyes met Carlton's. Carlton stood on the sidewalk, watching impassively as his former friend was taken away. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, only a resolution. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The news of Stephen's arrest sent shockwaves through their social circle. It was the final nail in the coffin of Victoria and Jerome's attempts to rehabilitate their image. With their co-conspirator headed to prison, their own misdeeds were once again thrust into the spotlight. Carlton, for his part, refused to comment on Stephen's arrest. When pressed by reporters, he simply said, "The evidence speaks for itself. I trust our justice system to handle the matter appropriately." As the dust began to settle, Carlton turned his focus to the future. He had protected his reputation, exposed the truth, and set the stage for justice to be served. Now it was time to rebuild his life and create a better future for his daughters. The law offices of Sherry Woodward were a study in understated elegance. Carlton sat across from his attorney, reviewing the final draft of the divorce papers. Every clause had been meticulously crafted to leave Victoria with as little as possible. "Are you positive about this, Carlton?" Sherry asked, her sharp eyes studying her client. "It's an aggressive strategy. The courts might see it as punitive," she replied. Carlton's smile was cold. "After everything that's come to light, I think the courts will understand. Besides, Victoria's own actions have turned public opinion against her. No judge wants to be seen as sympathetic to someone who manipulated her own children." Sherry nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Very well. I'll have these served to Victoria immediately." Across town, Victoria sat in the living room of the house she had once shared with Carlton. The room was eerily empty. Most of the furniture and decor were already gone. She jumped at the sound of the doorbell, her heart racing as she opened the door to find a stone-faced process server. "Victoria Bright, you've been served." Victoria's hands shook as she opened the envelope. As she read through the divorce terms, her face drained of color. Carlton was leaving her with nothing. No alimony, no share in their assets, not even her car. The only thing she would retain was the clothes on her back and the unborn child she carried. "He can't do this," she shrieked, causing the process server to take a step back. "I'll fight it." Her tirade was cut short as she noticed a moving truck pulling up to the house. A team of movers began efficiently loading the remaining furniture in boxes. "What's going on?" Victoria demanded, storming out onto the front lawn. "Stop. This is my home." A calm voice behind her made her spin around. "Not anymore." Carlton stood there, his expression impassive. "The house has been sold. Victoria, proceedings are going to a women's shelter, by the way," he added, seeming fitting. Victoria's voice rose to a screech. "You can't do this. Where am I supposed to go?" Carlton's smile was devoid of warmth. "That's not my problem anymore. Though I'm sure Jerome will be happy to take care of you and your child. That was the plan, wasn't it?" As Carlton walked away, Victoria felt the full weight of her actions crash down upon her. She was alone, pregnant, and now effectively homeless. Meanwhile, Jerome Bailey's carefully constructed world was crumbling just as thoroughly. His wife, Samantha, had filed for divorce, taking their children and half of Jerome's assets with her. But that was just the beginning. The scandal had spooked investors, and Jerome's real estate empire was imploding. Projects were stalled, partners were backing out, and lawsuits from angry clients were piling up. Jerome found himself spending more time with his lawyers than at construction sites. To make matters worse, an anonymous tip to the FBI had launched a full-scale investigation into Jerome's business practices. As federal agents combed through his records, Jerome realized that his shady dealings were about to catch up with him in a big way. Victoria and Jerome, once the toast of their social circle, now found themselves pariahs. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them. Invitations dried up. Whispers and pointed fingers followed them everywhere they went. Finally, unable to bear the constant scrutiny and judgment, they made the decision to leave town, their carefully constructed lives in shambles. Carlton, on the other hand, was thriving. The family court, presented with overwhelming evidence of Victoria's infidelity and emotional manipulation of the children, had granted him full custody of Emma and Olivia. The girls, initially shaken by the upheaval, were flourishing under their father's care. Carlton's professional life was equally successful. He used his newfound fame and respect to start a foundation supporting environmental causes and helping children affected by parental infidelity. The Bright Future Foundation quickly gained national attention, with Carlton's personal story lending weight and credibility to its mission. As for Carlton himself, he had relocated with his daughters to a beautiful, eco-friendly home on the coast. The sound of waves crashing against the shore served as a constant reminder of the new life they were building together. It was on a sunny afternoon at the beach that Carlton met Marla Rodriguez. She was a marine biologist and single mother, her young son building sandcastles with Emma and Olivia. As they talked, Carlton found himself drawn to Marla's intelligence, kindness, and genuine warmth. For the first time in years, Carlton felt a spark of something he had thought long dead, the possibility of true love and partnership. Marla showed him that loyalty and trust weren't myths. Not everyone had an ulterior motive. As the sun set over the ocean, Carlton watched his daughters playing with Marla and her son. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. The betrayals of his past had made him stronger and wiser. He would never forget the lessons learned, but he was ready to embrace this new chapter of his life. The architect of vengeance had completed his masterwork. Now, it was time for Carlton Bright to build something new, a future filled with love, trust, and the family he deserved. Epilogue. 5 years later, the bustling courthouse in downtown Manhattan hummed with activity as Victoria Bright, now Victoria Callahan, was led away in handcuffs. Her once impeccable appearance was a shadow of its former self. Designer clothes replaced by a drab jumpsuit, perfectly coiffed hair now limp and graying. The judge's words still rang in her ears. 10 years for fraud, misappropriation, and conspiracy. Victoria's fall from grace had been spectacular and complete. After fleeing her old life, she and Jerome had tried to start over in New York City, but their past misdeeds continued to haunt them. Victoria's attempts to launch a new fashion line were met with derision and boycotts. Investors, burned once by the scandal, steered clear. Desperate and running out of options, Victoria and Jerome had turned to increasingly risky ventures. A Ponzi scheme targeting wealthy individuals had seemed like the perfect plan, until it all came crashing down. Now, Victoria faced a decade behind bars, her unborn child long since given up for adoption. Jerome Bailey's fate had been no less dire. His FBI investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that spanned years: money laundering, bribery, and connections to organized crime. The charges had piled up like a house of cards. In the end, Jerome had tried to flee the country, only to be caught in a dramatic airport takedown. Now serving 25 years in a federal penitentiary, Jerome's once charming smile had twisted into a bitter scowl. His fellow inmates, many of them victims of predatory real estate practices, took particular pleasure in reminding Jerome of his new lowly status. Back in their old hometown, life had moved on. Stephen Ho, released after serving 3 years for misappropriation, scraped by working as a night janitor at the same country club where he had once been a valued member. His financial acumen was now limited to stretching his meager paycheck to cover rent on a dingy studio apartment. Samantha Bailey, Jerome's ex-wife, had found unexpected strength in the aftermath of the scandal. Using her share of the divorce settlement, she had opened a pediatric clinic serving underprivileged communities. Her work brought her a sense of purpose and fulfillment she had never known in her marriage to Jerome. Buddy Blackwell's expose on global tech had catapulted him to journalistic stardom. Now a respected environmental correspondent for a major news network, Buddy often collaborated with Carlton's foundation on hard-hitting investigative pieces. And what of Carlton Bright, the architect of this grand revenge? The years had been kind to him. Lines of experience etched around eyes that now sparkled with contentment rather than simmering rage. The Bright Future Foundation had grown into a powerhouse nonprofit, its dual mission of environmental protection and supporting children of broken homes earning accolades nationwide. Carlton's office walls were lined with awards and commendations, but he took the most pride in the letters from families his organization had helped. Emma and Olivia, now teenagers, had blossomed under their father's care. The trauma of their early years had faded, replaced by the security of knowing they were truly loved and supported. Both girls showed a passion for environmental science, often joining their father on foundation projects during school breaks. Carlton's personal life had flourished as well. His relationship with Marla Rodriguez had deepened over the years, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and shared values. They had married in a small ceremony on the beach 2 years ago, their children serving as attendants. Their blended family lived in harmony in the eco-friendly coastal home, which had been expanded to accommodate everyone comfortably. Marla's marine biology work complemented Carlton's environmental initiatives, and together they were a formidable force for positive change in their community. On this particular evening, Carlton stood on the deck of their home, watching the sun set over the ocean. Marla joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Carlton smiled, drawing her close. "Just thinking about how far we've come, how different things could have been." Marla nodded, understanding in her eyes. She knew Carlton's full story had helped him work through the lingering pain and anger. "Do you ever regret it? How things ended with Victoria and the others?" Carlton was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally, "but I don't regret protecting myself and the girls. We built something beautiful from the ashes of that betrayal." As if on cue, laughter drifted up from the beach where their children were having an impromptu bonfire. Emma and Olivia were animatedly explaining tide pools to Marla's son, their faces alight with enthusiasm. "We certainly did," Marla agreed, her voice warm. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their family below. Carlton felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The past couldn't be changed, but it had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who understood the value of true loyalty, the strength found in adversity, and the power of using one's skills for positive change. The architect of vengeance had long since laid down his tools. In their place, Carlton Bright had become an architect of hope, building a legacy that would far outlast the echoes of past betrayals. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Carlton and Marla joined their children on the beach. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to protect, and the love he had once thought lost forever, Carlton was exactly where he was meant to be. The story of the Bright family wasn't one of unending happiness. Life was too complex for that. But it was a story of resilience, of justice served, and of the power of choosing to build a brighter future, no matter how dark the past. And for Carlton, that was a story worth living.